So today I'm at home by myself because my husband is at work, so I decided to do a little cleaning around the house. And while I'm doing the dishes, I heard a knock at the door. And when I asked who is it, nobody answered. So I looked through my peephole and it's somebody that I don't even recognize. But it's a man, so I'm thinking he's a friend of my husband. So I go ahead and open the door. And out of nowhere, this man asks me, do I have a vajayjay? Now I'm standing there looking confused because obviously he can see that I'm a woman. So why are you asking me if I have lady parts, knowing that I have lady parts? But anyways, I didn't even answer the man. I just slammed the door in his face and I went back to cleaning my house. Well, a couple of hours passed and I hear another knock at my door. And when I opened my door, it was the same man from earlier asking me the same question. Do I have a vajayjay? Well, this time I said to him, I don't know why you're at my door, but when my husband come home, he'll deal with you. And that's when I slammed the door in his face again. So later on in the day, my husband comes home and I tell him what happened. And then my husband said to me, well, if that man comes back tonight, I want you to answer the door and I'll hide behind the door and listen. But this time he wanted me to say yes to the man's question just to see where he was going with this. So my husband is in the living room watching TV and I'm in the kitchen making dinner, and sure enough, the same man knocked on our door. But this time my husband got up and ran to the door before me, and that's when he told me to pretend like he's not even there. So I opened the door and the man asked me the question again. Do I have a vajayjay? And this time I told him yes, just like my husband told me to do. And that's when the man looked at me and said, well, would you mind telling your husband to leave my wife's alone and start using yours? So yesterday I was driving and I got pulled over by a police officer. And this made me really nervous because every time I get pulled over, I get a ticket. And I didn't even know why I was getting pulled over. But anyways, he walked up to my window and asked me to roll it down. So that's what I did. And just when I was about to ask him what the problem was, he handed me a check for $6,000. He said, congratulations, you just won $6,000 for wearing your seatbelt. I guess it was a safety competition going on and I didn't know nothing about it. And then the police officer asked me what was I going to do with the prize money. I hesitated for a minute and then I said, I guess I'll go to driving school to get my license. And right after I said that, my best friend who was sitting in the passenger seat told the officer to not listen to me because I'm a smart aleck when I'm drunk. And that's when I looked at her and started laughing, but my laughing woke up my cousin who was laying in the back seat. And when my cousin saw the cop, he just started panicking. He said, man, I knew we weren't finna get nowhere in this stolen car. And at that moment, I just looked at the police officer and nervously smiled at him. But not too long after that, there was a knock coming from the trunk. And the voice from the trunk said, hello, are y'all gonna let me go? So yesterday, my husband came home late from being out with his friends all day as usual. But to his surprise, he found me in bed with another man. And he got so mad to the point where he wanted to leave the house, but I stopped him because I had something to say. I said, look, before you leave, I wanted you to hear how this all came about. I'll try to explain myself. That's when he looked at me and I told him when I was driving home from the store, I saw this man walking and he was looking really tired. So I offered him a ride and then he told me he was hungry, so I brought him home and fed him some of the roast you had forgotten about in the refrigerator. And after I told my husband that, he was just standing there like he was speechless. But anyways, I continued. I said his shoes were worn out, so I gave him a pair of your shoes you didn't wear because you said they were out of style. And he was also cold, so I gave him that sweater that I bought you on your birthday that you never wore because you didn't like the color. Then I said his slacks was worn out, so I gave him a pair of yours you can't fit anymore. And right before you came, the man was about to leave, but then he paused at the front door and asked me, is there anything else that my husband doesn't use anymore? That's when I looked at my husband and I said, so here we are. So I used to work at a nursing home, and one evening a family brought their elderly mother in. They got her registered and everything, and then they just left her there hoping that she would be well cared for, which she was. Well, anyways, the next morning when I was on duty, I gave her a bath, and then I fed her a tasty breakfast, and I sat her next to her window in a chair where she can overlook the garden. And she seemed like she was doing fine, but after a while, she started slowly leaning in her chair to the side, and I thought she was about to fall, so me and another nurse rushed over to her and straightened her up. And after that, she was doing just fine. She was sitting up straight. But then 15 minutes later, she started to lean over to the other side. So me and the same nurse rushed back over there to help her sit up straight. And that went on all morning. I was very exhausted trying to get that lady to sit up straight in her chair. But anyways, later on that evening, the family arrives just to see how their mother is doing. Like, was she adjusting to the nursing home well? And I was in the room making up her bed while her daughter asked her how was she doing. And she also asked her, was we treating her right? And I'm thinking to myself, she was going to answer yes because we was treating her right. But instead, she said, oh, it's pretty nice, but they won't let you fart. When I first moved out of my mom's house, I had got a small apartment and I had a roommate who was a male. Well, anyways, my mom had came and visited me for dinner and my roommate stayed and had dinner with us. And my mom noticed that he was handsome and she's already been suspicious about me and him being in a relationship. And my roommate staying to have dinner with us made her even more curious. So the entire evening, she was watching how me and my roommate interacted with each other and that gave her the wrong idea. And I seen the look on her face while she was watching us. And I was like, Mom, I promise you, me and him are just roommates, nothing more. And she didn't even say a word. She just gave us a hug goodbye and then she left. Well, anyways, a week later, my roommate came to me looking for a silver plate. He was like, look, ever since your mother came to visit, it's been missing. So you don't think she accidentally took it or anything like that, do you? Now, I told him that I doubt that she took it, but I'll text her just to be sure. And that's when I texted her and I said, after you visited me the other night, our silver plate has been missing. Then I said, I'm not saying that you took it and I'm not saying that you didn't take it, but the fact remains that it's been missing ever since you came and visited. Now, she waited a couple of days to text me back because I think she was upset. But anyways, when she texted me back, she said, I'm not saying that you do sleep with your roommate and I'm not saying that you don't sleep with him. Then she said, but the fact remains, if he was sleeping in his own bed, he would have been found that silver plate by now under his pillow. So yesterday I was at my grandparents' house, and while I was in the house, they were sitting on the porch in their rocking chairs. I was in the kitchen washing out a cup to get me something to drink, and that's when I looked out the window. Tell me why I see my grandmother slap my grandfather upside the head. She hit him so hard he fell out of his rocking chair. And then I seen him slowly get back up, rubbing his head. But anyways, my grandfather asked my grandmother why did she hit him. And she gonna tell him it was for 50 years of terrible love making. Gonna tell my grandfather he wasn't good in bed. And he didn't even do nothing. He just sat there and stared at her for a moment. And that's when I moved from the window to the refrigerator to pour me some lemonade. And that's when I heard my grandmother scream. So I ran back to the window and it turns out he done slapped her back. He slapped her so hard she ended up rolling down the porch steps. She started yelling, asking him what was that for. He stood up out of his chair and he said for knowing the difference. So I had a handyman working on my roof yesterday and I was also babysitting my nephew. And my nephew is bad. But anyways, while I was in the living room watching TV, the handyman knocked on my door to complain about my nephew bothering him. So I had asked him what my nephew was doing because he's supposed to be outside playing with his friends, not bothering my handyman. So my handyman told me that he was working on top of my house and he accidentally dropped a hammer. So he climbed down the ladder to get the hammer. And that's when my nephew told the handyman that his dad would have had two hammers so he wouldn't have to climb down the ladder when he dropped one. And I'm thinking to myself, that's not so bad. My nephew just bragging about his father. But anyways, I told the handyman that I'll talk to my nephew and I promised that my nephew would leave him alone. So my handyman went back outside and started back working, but like 10 minutes later, he knocked on my door again. And this time he said he accidentally dropped his screwdriver. And when he climbed down the ladder to get it, my nephew was standing right there. Then my nephew told the handyman that his dad would have had two screwdrivers. So if he dropped one, he wouldn't have to come down the ladder to get it. All I could do was apologize again for my nephew's behavior. So the handyman took my word for it and he went back outside to work on my house. But 15 minutes later, the handyman knocked on my door again to complain about my nephew. So before he could explain anything, I said, you must have dropped one of your tools again. I am so sorry. He said, no, this time I had to use the bathroom and I didn't want to bother you, so I went in the bushes. And that's when he said my nephew followed him. And then he said to my nephew, I suppose your dad has two of these too. My nephew looked at him and said, nope, but my dad's twice as big. So I remember when I was a new mom and I had to take the bus to get to my mother's house. And my newborn baby wakes up from her nap and she starts crying, but that only meant she was ready to be fed. So I look into her diaper bag to see if she had any bottles left, but I forgot. Before we had got on the bus, she had drunk her last bottle. And the only thing left for me to do was to breastfeed her. So I lifted her up out her car seat so I can breastfeed her, but she wouldn't take it. But there was this man sitting right next to us, so I decided to use him to get my baby to eat. So I told my daughter if she didn't eat, I'll have to give it to this nice man sitting right next to us. But 10 minutes passed and my baby still didn't want to latch on. And that's when I said, please eat, honey, because if you don't, I'll have to give it to this nice man here. And for some reason, my baby still didn't want to latch on. And at that point, I was getting stressed out because she wouldn't stop crying. And I knew she was hungry because when I gave her an empty bottle, she was trying to drink from it. And that's when I tried to get her to latch on to my breast again. I said, honey, if you don't eat, this man right here is going to be very lucky. But like 2 minutes later, the man just started yelling. He said, come on, kid, make up your mind because I was supposed to get off 5 stops ago. So I remember when I was around 7 years old and I had to wake up in the middle of the night just to go use the bathroom. Well, when I was on the way back to bed, I had passed by my parents' room, but their door was cracked. So me being nosy, I had peeped through the crack and noticed that the covers were bouncing up and down. Now I didn't know what was going on, so I just walked into their room, and that's when my dad looked at me like he was embarrassed or something. But anyways, I asked my dad what he was doing, and he hesitated for a little bit. And then he told me that he was playing cards. And that's when I said, oh, well, who is your partner? And he told me that my mom was his partner. After that, I just walked out their room and closed their door. And then I started heading back towards my room. But then I walked past my older sister's room, and that's when I noticed that her covers were bouncing up and down. So I walked into her room and asked her what she was doing, and she also told me that she was playing cards. So I asked her who was her partner, and she told me that her boyfriend was. And that's when I just walked out her room and shut the door. And as soon as I finally made it back to my bedroom, I looked across the hall and noticed that my brother's bedroom door was cracked. So again, I wanted to be nosy and I peeked through the crack. And that's when I saw his covers bouncing up and down. So that's when I walked in and I said, you must be playing cards too. He looked at me like he didn't know what I was talking about. But then he finally answered yes to my question. And that's when I said, oh, that's really cool. Well, who's your partner? He stared at me for a minute. And then he said, you don't need a partner if you have a good hand. When I was 15 years old, I finally got to date my high school crush. But anyways, one day after school, he wanted to walk me home. Well, we ended up going to his house instead because I guess his parents wasn't home. Anyways, once we got to his house, we were standing at his front door. And before he could open the door, he turned to look at me. He said, wait a minute, my dad always told me that a woman can always tell how a man makes love by how he unlocks his door. So I'm thinking to myself, is this man trying to riz me or something? But anyways, I told him to give me some examples. Like, show me what you mean by that, sir. So he shoves his key into the door. And that's when he said if a guy shoves his key into the lock and he opens the door hard, that means he's a rough lover. And he's not a rough lover. And I was like, okay. Then he took the key out of the lock and he said if a man fumbles around and seems to can't find the hole, that means he's inexperienced. And that's when I was like, oh, okay, so how do you unlock your door? He looked at me and started licking his lips. And then he said, well, first, before I do anything else, I lick the lock. When I was a doctor, this man came into my doctor's office telling me that he wanted to be castrated. Now, this shocked me, so I asked him, why on earth do you want to be castrated? He told me it's something that's been on his mind for a very long time and he just wants the procedure done. And that's when I told him that I understand, but I still asked him, have he thought this through properly? Because I never had a man come to my doctor's office asking me, can I do this type of surgery on them? So I tried to explain to him that this is a serious operation and once it's done, there's no going back. But he told me that he was aware of that and he's not going to change his mind. Then he told me if I don't do the surgery, he's just going to go to another doctor. So I did the surgery for him, but he had to stay at the hospital overnight just so he can do a little physical therapy in the morning. And sure enough, the next morning he was walking slowly up and down the hallway with his legs apart. And that's when he seen me heading towards him with another patient who was walking exactly like him. So he stopped us in the hallway and started speaking to the other patient. He said, hey, my name is Steve, but it looks like we had the same surgery. And before I could say anything, the man said, well, after 40 years of living, I finally decided it was time to get circumcised. That's when Steve stared at us like he was scared or something. And then out of nowhere, he just started screaming. He said, oh my God, that's the word? So last night I went to a bar by myself, and as soon as I walked in, there was this drunk man sitting at the bar. and he was just sitting there mumbling something under his breath. And when I seen he was talking to himself, I thought something was wrong with him. So I sat right next to him just to see if he needed help or something. Cause I'm thinking maybe he needs a ride home or he just needs somebody to call him a Uber. But when I finally got close enough to hear what he was actually saying, I was confused. Because he kept mumbling, "This looks like plastic but feels like rubber," while he's looking at something in his hand. So I looked down at his hand trying to figure out what he's talking about, because what looks like plastic and feels like rubber? But I politely asked him could I see the object that he's holding in his hand so I could help him figure it out. So that's when he put the object in my hand, and then I started feeling it. And I started thinking to myself, this really does look like plastic but feels like rubber. And that's when I turned to him and said, "Well, if you can tell me where you got this from, I can help you figure out what this is." He looked at me and said, "Oh, I got that from my nose." So yesterday I was at the park sitting on a bench, and then a homeless man came up and sat down right next to me. And I didn't move or nothing because I'm a really nice person, but I was curious though. I started thinking to myself, how could a person end up like this? Just living on the streets, like do they have family, friends, anybody that can help them? And I didn't want to seem rude, so I just politely asked him could I ask him a personal question. And he told me that he didn't mind, so I asked him how did he end up this way. I said, "Why are you living on the streets? Don't you have friends and family to help you?" He looked at me and said, "Well, up until last week, I had it all." He told me that he had a personal cook, his clothes were always washed and pressed, and he had a roof over his head. I'm thinking to myself, wow, he really went from being rich to living on the streets. And then he continued. He told me that he had TV, the internet, and he went to the gym. And he also studied in the library. He said his life was really good. I'm thinking to myself, dang. And then I asked him, well, what happened? Was it drugs, alcohol, a divorce? He said, oh, no, it was nothing like that. I just got out of prison. So I remember when I was in the sixth grade and our teacher was giving us a quiz. She was holding an object behind her back and she wanted us to guess what the object was. So she told the class that she had something red and round and we could eat it. And then she said, what is it? And that's when the whole class raised their hand to answer the question. And she called on Chelsea, and Chelsea asked her, was it an apple? The teacher said, it's not an apple, it's a tomato, but it shows your thinking. And after that, the teacher moved on to the next object. She said, I've now got something round and it has a greenish color and you can also eat this. And a boy named Jerome yelled out and said, oh, that's easy, that's a grape. The teacher said, no, it's an onion, but it shows your thinking. Now the teacher went to go get another object, but before she could, Mark, the class clown, told the teacher that he had an object. Now at first the teacher didn't even want him to speak, but since this was his first time getting involved in a lesson, she let him. And that's when Mark said, I've got something under my desk that's an inch long, white, and it has a red end. And the teacher got so angry, she called him a dirty little boy, and then she told him to get out the classroom. And then he said, no, it's a match, but it shows you were thinking. So before my husband proposed to me, I had a confession to make. And I remember I was so embarrassed to tell him because I suffer from a disease that's rare. But anyways, I had to tell him that this disease makes my boobs small. Like even with age, they will not grow. Anyways, after I told him about my disease, he was okay with it. I was scared he was going to leave me. But he told me he had a problem too. And when I asked him what his problem was, he told me that his private area was the same size as an infant. Now this came as a shock to me, but I told him that I could deal with it as long as he could deal with my disease. Anyways, after we got married, we couldn't wait to finally make love to each other. So we headed to our honeymoon suite and we started kissing and touching on each other. But as soon as I put my hands down my husband's pants, I started screaming and I just ran out the room. My husband ran after me and found me in the hallway. And then he asked me what was wrong, and that's when I looked him dead in the face. I said, you lied to me. You told me that your private area was the size of an infant. He put his hand on my shoulder and he said, yes, it is. 8 pounds, 7 ounces. So a couple of nights ago, me and my homegirl went to a bar and we got wasted. And we both lived like 2 blocks away from the bar, so we just decided to walk home. But there is a little shortcut that we take and it's through the graveyard. And as we're walking through the graveyard, we both had to pee. So we both split up to go pee. And I didn't have nothing to wipe with, so I used my underwear and then I tossed it out. My friend, on the other hand, peed right next to a tombstone and there was a wreath with a ribbon on it, and that's what she used to wipe herself. Now, when I got home to my husband, he was asleep, but the next morning he found out that I came home without my underwear. And of course, he jumped to conclusions. He ended up calling my homegirl's husband, yelling through the phone, talking about my wife came home without her underwear on. And that's when I overheard my homegirl's husband on the other end of the phone. He sounded upset too. He said, "Oh, that's nothing. My wife came back with a card stuck between her butt cheeks. And it said, from all of us at the fire station, we'll never forget you." So a couple of months ago, I was feeling down because I just found out some really bad news. So I decided to go sit at a bar. And I told the bartender that I needed 4 drinks. And he was like, 4 drinks? You must have had a really rough day. I said, yeah, something like that. After all this time, I just found out that my sister is gay. The bartender handed me my drinks and he was like, well, everyone has their own path. But anyways, I finished my drinks and then I went home. And the very next day, I walked into the bar again because I heard some very bad news. And of course, I asked the bartender to give me 4 drinks. And he was like, wow, another rough day? I was like, yeah, I just found out that my oldest daughter is gay. He handed me my drinks and he was like, well, that's her choice. After he said that, I just finished my drinks and then I went home. Now, the third day, I went back to the bar because I found out some more bad news. And I told the bartender that I needed 4 drinks again. The bartender was like, oh my God, you had another rough day? I said, yeah, I just found out that my youngest daughter is gay. That's when the bartender told me that it's up to her who she's attracted to. I was like, well, I guess so. And then I finished my drinks and I went home. Now, the fourth day, I went to the bar and asked for 4 drinks. The bartender was like, dang, doesn't anyone in your family like men? I was like, yeah, my husband does. So a couple of years ago, I was single and sitting at a bar, maybe hoping to find somebody who was willing to leave with me and keep me company for the rest of the night. But anyways, an hour before the bar closed, a man walked in and he was wearing an army suit. And I was just sitting there thinking to myself, well, ain't he handsome? Well, anyways, he sat right next to me and ordered a beer, and that's when I made my move. I just introduced myself and he told me that he was an army general. And that's when I started flirting. I said, well, when is the last time you ever made love to a woman? He looked at me and said, 1956, ma'am. Now I was shocked. I said, 1956? It's been that long? Then I told him to come with me and I'll make his night better. He didn't even hesitate. As soon as we left the bar, we went back to my apartment and we made love. But anyways, it lasted for about an hour and then we cuddled. And the love making was so good, I said, well, you sure haven't forgotten anything since 1956. That's when he looked at me like he was confused. He said, well, I sure hope not. It's only 21:30 now. So I used to be a madam at a brothel that was located in Florida. And I remember one night these 2 drunk men stopped at the brothel on their way home. Well, anyways, I thought they were easy targets, so I told the girls to put the men in separate rooms with blow-up dolls, hoping they was too drunk to notice that the blow-up dolls weren't real women. And I also did this so my girls could get a break. But anyways, I had the security on standby just in case something went wrong. And everything went smooth. The men were done in like an hour, and I also heard their conversation as they were leaving the brothel. I was trying not to eavesdrop, but I wanted to hear how their experience was. Well, apparently, one of the men thought his girl was dead. And when his friend asked him why, he said because she was very cold and didn't move or make a sound. Then his friend said, well, I think mine was a witch. The first man said, well, I wouldn't doubt it because mine was dead, but why do you think yours was a witch? That's when his friend looked at him and said, well, when I bit her butt, she farted in my face and flew out the window. When I was younger, there was only one subject that I always struggled with in school, and it was math. And my parents tried to help me by hiring tutors, using flashcards, and sending me to special learning centers. But nothing worked, and they tried everything they could think of. So their last and final option was to send me to a local Catholic school. And we weren't even Catholic, so I was a little bit confused about that. But anyways, after the first day of school, I came home with a very serious look on my face. I didn't even speak to my mother or nothing. I just went straight to my room and I started studying. And when my mother came to check on me, she seen books and papers spread all over my desk. And when it was time for dinner, my mother came and got me from my room. After I was done eating, I just went back up to my room without saying a word, and I just started back studying. But anyways, this went on for a while, and my mother started wondering what could have made me start studying out of nowhere. And when I finally finally came home with my report card, I just quietly gave it to my mother, and then I went to my room and started studying again. My mom looked at my report card and seen that I had an A in math, and she was so surprised she could no longer hold back her curiosity. So she came to my room and asked me why was I acting so different. She said, was it the nuns at the Catholic school? And that's when I looked at her and shook my head no. And then I said, well, on the first day of school, I seen this guy on the wall, and he was nailed to a big plus sign. And that's when I knew they wasn't finna play with me. I used to love growing tomatoes, but for some reason I couldn't get them to turn red. Well, one day I was walking in my neighborhood and then I passed my neighbor's house and I seen he had this beautiful garden full with huge red tomatoes. Now, even though I didn't know him, I still went to go knock on his door just to ask him how did he get his tomatoes so red. And after I asked him the question, he told me he would just stand in front of his tomato garden twice a day, butt naked. He said his tomatoes turned red from blushing so much. Now, of course, I thought he was just flirting, but what if he was actually right? So I decided to go home and stand in front of my tomato garden butt naked just to see if it'll work. And I did this 3 times a day for 2 weeks, hoping for the best. Well, one day my neighbor was walking past my house and I was sitting on the porch. And then he asked me, well, how did it go? Did your tomatoes finally turn red? I looked up at him and said, no, but you wouldn't believe what happened to my cucumbers. He said, well, what happened to your cucumbers, ma'am? And that's when I said they grew enormous. So me and my husband decided to take a walk in the park yesterday because it was beautiful outside and we just wanted to enjoy the weather. Well, we decided to sit down on a bench because we was walking around the park for a couple of hours. So we were cuddling on the bench and then my ear started hurting out of nowhere. I said to my husband that my ear was hurting me and then he tried to be romantic and started kissing me gently on my ear. He then asked me did it feel better now and I started giggling and I told him that the pain was all gone. But then I pointed to my neck and told him that I felt some pain there too. That's when my husband held my face and started kissing me on my neck very slowly. He said, does that feel better now, sweetheart? That's when I smiled at him and I told him that it was all healed. And after that, I pointed to my chest and I told my husband that I had a little bit of chest pain. My husband smiled at me and then started kissing me slowly on my chest. We were getting hot and ready on that bench. And after a couple of kisses on my chest, I told my husband that it was all good now. And that's when we heard this old man who was sitting on a bench right next to us. He said, excuse me, but that was really impressive. Does your husband heal hemorrhoids as well?